The long-anticipated wedding of Maria Josepha of Austria, the eldest child of Emperor Joseph I and the Saxon electoral prince Frederick August, took place in 1719 amidst much splendour and lavish cultural display. Integral to the creation of the festivities' necessary pomp was sizable numbers of trumpeters and kettle drummers, whose presence signalled the varied ranks and power of the key participants, both visually, with their striking uniforms and expensive instruments decorated with coats of arms, and orally, through the fanfares and other pieces they performed. For the procession marking the entry of the newly married couple into Dresden, on the 2nd of September 1719, for example, the bride was accompanied by 8 trumpeters and 2 kettle drummers, whereas the Saxon electoral and royal Polish entourages were each allocated 24 trumpeters and 2 kettle drummers in order to mark their superior rank. An even greater number of trumpeters was required for the 4 quadrilles that formed the horse ballet Carousel of the Elements, which took place on the 15th of September during the so-called Jupiterfest. In total, 64 trumpeters took part, a demand that led to the recruitment of extra players from neighbouring towns and military contingents. As can be seen from the lower right-hand portion of this slide, for this entertainment, the trumpeters and kettle drummers were dressed thematically, here representing the element of water, in silver and pale blue. As Elizabeth Huckspiel-Mikosch has noted, the more usual official livery of these musicians was similar in nature to that worn by other uniformed court servants. However, they were distinguished from the latter chiefly through the inclusion of purely decorative, long and narrow additional sleeves, so-called Zierärmel, that hung down the back. And you can see these fairly clearly in the first 4 illustrations here, which are also from the wedding festivities held in Dresden in 1719. So these things here. In all, 521 servants received new uniforms for the occasion, made from more costly materials than their ordinary everyday livery. The first 2, the black and yellow stripes, are from the Saxon Hartschiergarde. The second 2, yellow and blue, represent the electoral Saxon retinue, while the last 2, red, blue and gold, are from the royal Polish entourage. There can be no doubt that from these examples that the playing of trumpets and kettle drums signalled the rank and importance of the nobility they accompanied, as had been confirmed by the articles signed by Emperor Ferdinand II in 1623. And point 9 of that document deals with the fact that the trumpet was only to be played for the nobility. To contravene this imperial privilege was viewed as an attack on the upper classes. In the town of Esslingen in 1670, for example, when a number of local musicians began performing on trumpets and kettle drums for the wedding breakfasts of commoners, the collected court, field and musical trumpeters and kettle drummers complained to the Duke of Württemberg that such activity risked weakening the high-ranking authority of potentates, princes, counts and lords. Yet despite the trumpet having served as the special acoustical hallmark of the ruling class, in the words of musicologist Walter Salmon, trumpeters and kettle drummers themselves appear not to have held a special social rank. As Christian Ahrens demonstrated in his 2011 article, Fiktion und Realität, die Privilegien der Trompete und Pauke, since its publication in 1795, Johann Ernst Altenburg's Anleitung zur heroisch-musikalischer Trompete- und Pauke-Kunst has determined our perception of trumpet and drum guilds and their position in society. Following a comprehensive investigation of Central German sources, encompassing the courts of Dresden, Gotha, Sondershausen and Weimar, Ahrens concluded that in fact, these musicians were not generally accorded special prominence. and that their financial and social status was average, situated in the middle range. They enjoyed special rights and privileges only when serving in an official military capacity or for governmental and political functions. Thus, Altenburg's description of privileged trumpeters and drummers has less to do with reality and more to do with fiction. In this paper, I draw upon archival material from both court and church to explore further the role played by trumpeters and kettle drummers at the courts of Saxony, Dresden, and Württemberg, Stuttgart, respectively, in the years 1700 to 1740, roughly speaking. In particular, I'll focus on the social status of these musicians, including some preliminary analysis of contemporary marriage and baptismal records. I'd like to begin by briefly outlining the numbers of trumpeters and kettle drummers employed at these two courts and their position within the court's official hierarchies or Rangordnungen. In 1795, Altenburg noted that the Saxon electoral court employed 8 trumpeters and 1 kettle drummer, while during the time of the King of Poland, August the Strong, and his son Friedrich August, they numbered 12 trumpeters plus 2 kettle drummers. Altenburg also notes that at the Ducal Court of Stuttgart, among others, 8 trumpeters and 1 kettle drummer were generally employed. These numbers seem to have been more or less accurate. The Dresden Hofenstaatskalender for 1728 lists 12 court trumpeters, including the Oberhoftrompeter Christian Becker, 2 court kettle drummers, and a Paukermoor, Franciscus Barantonius. 2 further trumpeters, plus an Oberpauker, who may have been the same musician as court kettle drummer Johann Georg Franz, were also listed as members of the King's Cavalry Guard. By 1735, if not earlier, the 3 trumpeters of the Cavalry Guard were also listed alongside the court trumpeters, while a trumpet scholar and a Pauker scholar had also been added. As noted by Janice Stockett, trainee trumpeters and kettle drummers had also been employed at the court in the first half of the 1720s. Similar fluctuations can also be seen at the Württemberg court. However, as indicated by Altenburg, generally 8 trumpeters plus 1 kettle drummer were indeed in service, as can be seen here in a register of court musicians from 1736. But where did these musicians rank in the overall hierarchy of the court that employed them? In 1989, Ortrand Landman commented that virtually no research has been carried out concerning the social status of musicians at the Dresden court in the early decades of the 18th century. In his analysis of Central German courts of that time, including Dresden, Ahrens came to the conclusion that trumpeters and kettle drummers were, at best, generally ranked somewhere in the middle of the court hierarchy, and most often placed below the other court musicians, as well as under other middle-ranked servants. In other words, far from the privileged position that many scholars have accorded them. Ahrens's recognition that the position of trumpeters and kettle drummers in Rangordnungen differed from region to region is confirmed by Württemberg sources, however. There, during the same time period, the trumpeters and kettle drummers were consistently ranked below the court's chamber musicians, but only marginally higher than the so-called ordinary musicians. This placed the trumpeters and kettle drummers below, but at around the same general level, as the confectionery maker, court apothecary, tutor to the court pages, court accounting officer, chamber lackeys, chamber porters, but above the court's cupbearers, those in charge of administering and maintaining the ducal silver collection, the court tapestry maker, and the personal house tailor. Taking a step back from the intricate arrangements of official court Rangordnungen, a document from 1720 paints a more generalized view of the class structure of the Württemberg court. Together with members of his immediate family and his sizable household, Duke Eberhard Ludwig of Württemberg made regular visits to the mineral springs at Wildebad, some 50 kilometers distant from Stuttgart. The mineral baths there were divided into categories by gender and class, with the wives of the court trumpeters, kettle drummers, and musicians allocated to the first class, or so-called Edelfrauen, or noblewomen's bad. They were clearly ranked a cut above the second class, which included wives of messengers, lackeys, and haiduks, stable hands, bakers, guards, and ordinary citizens, as well as maids from the kitchen, silver collection, and general household. The wives of grenadiers and other similarly lowly women were restricted to the third-class bards. There was, of course, another level of ranking amongst the trumpeters and kettle drummers themselves, which is reflected in their respective salaries, as we shall see. At the top were certainly the so-called musical trumpeters and kettle drummers, whose expertise was called upon when players, generally a trio of 2 trumpeters and a drummer, were needed to perform with the Hofkapelle, whether that be for church or table music, opera, ballets, or on other occasions. The ordinary Hoftrompeter und Pauke provided the stock fanfares required daily at mealtimes, for processions, official ceremonies, or sometimes specially composed works, as was the case for the 6 short pieces almost certainly composed by Jan Dismas Zelenka for the churching ceremony of Electress Maria Josepha in Dresden in August 1733. As explained by Altenburg, those among the Hoftrompeter who served on a military campaign could also be referred to as a Feldtrompeter, with the word Feld considered wie ein Ehrenwort, like a word of honor, having been earned through risking their Leib und Leben, life and limb. Such military service might take place either before or after their appointment at court. In 1712, for example, Duke Eberhard Ludwig of Württemberg ordered that one of his Hoftrompeter be selected to accompany him during his upcoming military campaign, specifying that the musician needed to be able to play a good Feldstück. In 1756, the Württemberg Hoftrompeter, Albrecht Andreas Fischer, claimed that he'd served the court for 62 years, including 13 military campaigns, and that he had survived 9 battles. Starting his career at the court as an apprentice oboist, in 1710 Fischer had been promoted to Hofmusikus und Trompeter. As mentioned earlier, salary lists often provide an indication of the relative rank of individual Hoftrompeter und Pauke. A register of Württemberg court musicians in 1717, for example, records the name of 2 musikalische Trompeter, Georg Melchior Fenchel, and his former pupil, and now son-in-law, Johann Friedrich Otto, plus 5 further trumpeters on the right of the screen, who included Johann Christoph Schmidt and his daughter, Elisabetta, who also played the trumpet, as well as a Hofpauke, Jeremias Christian Reisinger. Receiving 325 and 300 gulden each, respectively, the 2 musical trumpeters certainly earned more than the 4 Hoftrompeter, who received 250 gulden each, roughly the same amount as an ordinary Hofmusikus. The lower salary for the kettle drummer, Reisinger, can be explained by his concurrent position as a Landfuhrer. Elisabetta Schmidt had only been appointed as a Hoftrompeter the previous year, and her low salary rate, 150 gulden, reflected her position as a trainee musician, as is made clear from contemporary court documents. Interestingly, Schmidt continued to hold her position among the court trumpeters following her marriage in 1722, and did so up until the time of her death in 1731 at the age of 35. As we've seen, court documents can provide some, albeit limited, sense of the relative social position of these musicians within a courtly setting. But what of their relative rank beyond the confines of the court? Historically, along with pipers, fifer, trumpeters had belonged to a dishonourable profession. It had only been in the mid-16th century that the emperor had declared them eligible to become members of a guild. Yet, of course, as noted by William Reedy, historians have long recognised that it's impossible to be precise about class boundaries or class membership without violating the complexities and subtleties of social relationships. For the Württemberg court trumpeters and kettle drummers, church records of baptisms and marriages offer some insight into the social circles they moved in, although unfortunately it can be difficult to draw meaningful conclusions from the data they provide. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the marriages of the court trumpeters and kettle drummers during this period were largely to daughters and widows of other court employees, including other court trumpeters, a chamber secretary, specialist artisans, 2 princely personal tailors and a chamber lackey, but also to a merchant and to a Lutheran pastor. Trumpeters with the various regimental guards made similarly mixed choices when it came time to wed. To the daughters of a merchant, a ducal trumpeter, an apothecary, and a Salzkoch. All in all, these marriages could be described as predominantly horizontal rather than vertical. In other words, these musicians largely married into their own class rather than significantly above or below it. There are, for example, no members of the minor aristocracy or day labourers here. When it came to baptism, the data set for the Württemberg court trumpeters and kettle drummers is much, much larger, and I'm still working on it. As noted by Susan Carrant-Nunn in her 1997 study of religious ritual in early modern Germany, godparents were very carefully selected and were expected to give their spiritual offspring a present on the first anniversary of their birth or of their baptism. And although both Catholic and Protestant churches sought to limit the number of godparents to 3, higher up the social echelons, the numbers of such sponsors increased. A move along these lines can certainly be seen in the Württemberg Lutheran records, perhaps indicative of court employees being influenced by the customs of their noble superiors, or maybe part of a trend that can be seen elsewhere in the early 18th century Europe, including in Sweden. Particularly striking are the records for the court trumpeter and Moor, Dominicus Joseph de Acosta, for whose children the Duchess and members of her immediate family were included among the godparents. As Arne Spohr has shown in his recent study on blackness and social status in early modern Germany, this was common practice for black servants, who were generally former slaves, since it enforced the notion of their dependency on a spiritual level. More typical is the baptism of Johannes Augustus Fischer, a son born to Hoftrompeter and Hofmusikus Albrecht Andreas Fischer and his wife Regina Magdalena in July 1712. In total, 9 godparents are named, most of whom appear to have been chosen in order to extend the family's social relations, rather than serving to strengthen kinship bonds. They included Heinrich Scheinemann, a high-ranking court official, and as such the highest-ranking male, Philipp Christoph Fischer, a town judge, and probably a relation of the child's father, Wolfgang Brandburg, a stablemaster from Darmstadt, Theodor Zeller, a judge from the town of Vühlingen, Württemberg court Kapellmeister Johann Georg Christian Störl, and Hoftrompeter Georg Melchior Fenchel. Only 3 females were selected, 2 noble women, Johanna Christina von Hoff and Eleonora Benedicta von Gemmingen, whose husbands held the very highly ranked positions of Chief Master of the Hunt and Chief Cellarmaster, respectively. And these two positions came in at 14 and 15 on the Württemberg Rangordnung, so very, very highly ranked. Fascinatingly, the last woman to be named, Maria Anna Petz, was the unmarried daughter of the chief Kapellmeister and also happened to be Catholic. Clearly, a great deal more work needs to be done with this sizable data set, followed up by comparisons with other types of court employees and ordinary townspeople, along with identification of similar comparable records from the Saxon and other courts. In this way, it's hoped that we can come another step closer to understanding the complex social relationships of these key instrumentalists, whose music making constituted such a regular and important element of the sonic landscape of early modern German courts. Thank you.